Good day, everybody. I hope you are extremely well. Typically, this time of the year, I start moaning about the weather, and I must say this year is absolutely no difference. We can feel the winter coming on, but I hope everybody is very well. We are discussing a very fun topic today. We are talking about the application process and how that works, and why is it important to do proper vetting and in-depth tenant vetting, whose responsibility is it to decide on the tenant, and where does the agent's responsibility, how far does an agent's responsibility go when it comes to the application process. And then I obviously include the vetting process in a lot more detail than just the application process during this training session today. So I hope you are all focused and not too cold, so we can go through this session today. And then obviously, if you have any questions, you are more than welcome to ask me afterwards, or just pop me a mail or send me a voice note or whatever, so I can help you out with any questions or something that I might have missed. So without any further ado, I have a slideshow again for you today. I hope today that you're going to be super impressed with my slideshow, because I have actually embedded a sample credit check courtesy of Team TPN in this. So if this works, I am telling you, I'm going to be super impressed with myself, and then I need like thumbs ups and stuff, because I actually got an IT thing right without too much drama. So yes, we're hoping. If it blows up in my face, just smile and nod and forgive me for this one, but at least we're trying. Alrighty. So if we talk about the application process, this is obviously, I almost want to say, the most important part of your entire commencement process to get to your lease agreement. So how the story will typically play out would be, you as the agent receive mandate from the landlord to advertise the property, make it available to potential tenants to view the property and to consider renting the property from the landlord. So first off, I think you heard in my explanation here, in my sort of storytelling, most important thing is to have a proper mandate before you list the property. Now, I know every time I talk about mandate, and especially mandate before you list, I get a lot of frowns, but forgive me. The reason why I'm saying this is the more landlords are using agents and the more agents we have available in the country to accept rental mandates, the more important it's becoming to have a proper written mandate. If you list a property and you get a few viewings and the tenant signs the lease agreement, and you don't have a written mandate, or at the very least, written confirmation between you as the agent and the landlord that you will be the party that's going to advertise this property and potentially place a tenant, and most important of all, this will be my commission percentage if I find a tenant and I place a tenant. If that landlord, after the viewing, get in contact directly with the tenant, they conclude the agreement, even though you as the agent, with the effective course of that rental, how do we prove the commission percentage? How do we prove to any person quickly and without having to go to court that you are entitled to a certain portion of that commission, because you've been the reason why this landlord and tenant concluded the agreement? So it's really important. I know we can prove that you were the effective cause. I know that we can prove what the industry standard is on commission, but do we really want to go to court every single time we claim commission? Why don't we rather take the time to conclude that mandate agreement? Why this is important when we're talking about the application process is your mandate will tell you exactly how far your application process and vetting must go to before you place the tenant. So what I'm saying is, if you only have a procurement mandate, the application process is going to be exactly the same as in a management mandate. But in a procurement mandate, you're not going to build a long-term relationship with the tenant. You're going to list the property, you're going to go through the applications, you're going to advise the landlord accordingly. The landlord's going to make his selection on which tenant he's going to place. And from there, yes, we're hoping the transaction is finalized, you were paid for your services, and the landlord and tenant continues from there on out. However, if you have a management mandate, or the landlord might at a later stage convert your procurement mandate to a management mandate, it is very important already through the application process to keep in mind that you're going to build a relationship with this tenant, which is probably going to last for 12 or more months. And just keep it in the back of your head, because it might actually change the way you communicate with the tenants. So it's very important to know that your application process gives you and must give you a full view of this tenant that you are potentially going to place. So if we look at the application process, what is the purpose? Why are we doing this? It's not a requirement in law to go through an application process at all. This is something that we do because we've seen and we've learned that if we don't look at a potential tenant's payment profile history, at a potential tenant's credit record, and potential tenant's affordability and his potential exposure to creditors, we're not going to know if this tenant is going to be a good paying tenant for the subsistence of the lease, or if this is going to turn into a bit of a problem. So as much as the application process is very important when it comes to the conclusion of a lease agreement and your selection of a tenant, even the best application process, even the best tenant vetting is not going to exclude evictions completely. It's not going to mean that every time you do a proper vetting and a full, thorough application process, you're not going to have any problems. What it does mean is you're definitely going to have less, because as you filter the potential problem tenants out and you only allow the landlord the best potential tenants available for that property, you are definitely going to have much less problems. But still, you're still going to see evictions and you're still going to see problem tenants. It is the way it is. It's the nature of the beast. So don't be hard on yourself if you follow a full, proper application and vetting process and still you end up with a problem tenant. Remember, this is why, in terms of your lease agreement, we indemnify you against a non-paying tenant, against a tenant that's consistently in breach of his lease agreement. Because when you, as the rental agent, do everything in your power to ensure that you only introduce potential tenants to the landlord that is actually a good quality fit for the landlord, you can rest assured that you have fulfilled your mandate. You can show that you fulfilled your mandate. And the truth is, tenants that are in breach, non-paying tenants, and even squatting tenants isn't something we can exclude because of the quality of agent you are. That's the way it is. You are going to have problem tenants because life change and tenant circumstances change. And at the same time, some people just aren't the same. So some people might just take a chance and think it's okay to reside somewhere without paying their rent. I know the majority of people I know is definitely not potential squatting tenants, but I actually think there are people out there that actually doesn't even have an excuse not to pay rent, but that just decide, you know what, it takes long to evict someone, so I'm going to stay. So rest assured, as an agent, if you can show that you followed the application process thoroughly, even if there's a problem then arising with that tenant, it is the way it is. It is the risk of property investment. It's the risk of a buy-to-let portfolio, and it's only your obligation and mandate to do the best you possibly can. So to start off with, I'm sorry, I'm drinking tea. throughout. I had a few too many training sessions on top of each other. So if I don't drink tea throughout this recording, unfortunately, you're going to be stuck with a coughing me by about minute 15. So application form. Why do we do a lease application form? So first of all, like I said, it's not a requirement in law at all. I do, however, recommend it. And I think all of you are using a very similar lease application form. What we want in the lease application form is the full details of the potential tenant. So you can do full vetting on your potential tenant. Now, here's a little fun fact that I've seen over the past few weeks or months, is that there's a bit of confusion between who the tenant is and who the occupants are. So important. The tenant is the party contracting with the landlord. So the tenant is the party who must comply with the terms of the lease agreement and who must perform in terms of the lease agreement. So this is the party that acquires rights and obligations in terms of the lease agreement. This is the person who will be paying the rent. This is the person that, if he's not paying the rent, will receive the letter of demand. This is the person, if we need to do an eviction, this will be the respondent in the eviction application. The occupant is somebody who's residing through and under the tenant. A tenant may be an occupant, but doesn't have to be the occupant. For example, in student leasing or anything else, I am allowed to lease a property and I don't have to occupy the premises. I can lease the property, I'm the tenant, but my parents can reside in the property, or my student child may reside in the property. But I'm the one that has to ensure that the rental is paid. I'm the party that has to ensure that the occupants comply with the terms and the rules of this particular property and the terms of the lease agreement. You will always see, and if you don't see that, make sure that it must be in your lease agreement. There will always be, must always be a clause in the lease agreement where the tenant says, me, Mr. Tenant, Ms. Tenant, agree to ensure that all the occupants of this premises are aware of the terms of this lease agreement, are aware of the obligations of the tenant in terms of this agreement, and will comply with those terms. Because the tenant, as much as that's the only party who's responsible to perform in terms of the lease agreement, then has an obligation to ensure that the occupants of this premises are also adhering to the terms of the lease agreement. So your vetting is done on the potential tenant. If there are spouses who are married in or out of community of property, who do we do the vetting on, and who will the tenants be? Whose names do we complete on the lease application form? Well, whoever is going to be the tenant. The Matrimonial Properties Act specifically exclude rentals from the ambit of the Act. So you don't need consent from any spouse to conclude a lease agreement, whether it's the landlord or the tenant whose marriage we are talking about. So if you have parties, even if they are married in community of property, but they actually only plan to have one of the parties, only the wife will be the tenant in terms of this lease agreement, it's perfectly fine. You don't need both parties as tenants. However, I do recommend that you get as many as possible potential tenants on your lease application form. So in the case of spouses, both spouses are definitely better, not because of affordability, but it makes it easier for us to communicate with the potential tenants. If there's a problem, if the tenants aren't paying rent and you only have one of them, usually the other one doesn't even know about it. If they are both tenants, you are entitled to communicate any breach of the agreement with both parties, and it does make it safer. In the context of a student lease, I definitely recommend that both the student and the parents are then tenants. Because remember, your tenant does not have to occupy. Your tenant may occupy, but doesn't have to be an occupant. And then we need to record references. We need to know who the previous landlord was. But what's pretty important is when you look at your reference checks, you want the previous landlord, but honestly, my advice would be go 2 landlords back, because the previous landlord might have had this person only for a year, and actually the previous landlord had an issue. I would rather go back 2 landlords, but 1 is more than sufficient. Then obviously employment, and you want to do a bit of social media research on a person. Remember, this is not a contravention of POPI or anything else. If somebody's security settings on their social media profiles does allow anybody to view their profile, then you're more than entitled to do that. Why do I recommend this? If you view somebody's Facebook page and you see, oh my goodness, they constantly have photos of them partying, and there's a photo of them passed out somewhere in the veld, the statistical chance of these people being calm and like only reading their books and maybe knitting on Saturday afternoons are pretty few and far between. So what I would recommend is look at the kind of property, know what you want, and go look at social media profiles when you do your reference checks as well. See if it fits what the landlord wants. If it's a property that can cater for a braai and family gatherings and stuff like that, fantastic. If this person is clearly from their social media, a party animal of note. However, if the property is situated in a quiet, calm area, maybe that might not be the best fit for this property. So go into a bit more detail on your reference checks. So not just the ones that they're putting down on the application form, you are allowed to go a little wider. Obviously, you're never allowed to pretend to be somebody else or anything else to try and gather information. But if it's out there, you are allowed to consider that. Don't send somebody a social media friend request or follow request or whatever under false pretenses. That's definitely a no-no. But if it's open, if it's out there, maybe just quickly Google the person, see if you can find a bit of information on this person, and it might actually be very, very relevant to your application process. Remember that your application form is not a lease agreement. It does not create a binding agreement between the landlord and the tenant. This is simply a form that allows you to gather information to start your vetting process. Then you need consent. So your application form must always contain a consent clause for you to do the necessary vetting, to do the reference checks, to do the credit checks. It's really important to have this consent clause in your application form. You need to have consent, written consent, to do a credit check. If you do not, that is not in compliance with the National Credit Act, and you can end yourself in a world of trouble. Never, ever, 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 ever in your entire life do a credit check on a person without written consent. If you get audited and somebody catches you out on doing a credit check on a person without written consent, you can end up in more trouble than you would like to be. And then, who do you do the credit check on? Well, every single party that is going to be the potential tenant in terms of the lease agreement. The information that you gather from your credit check, you as the agent are doing this on behalf of the landlord. You are definitely allowed to share your credit information that you've gathered on the tenant with the landlord, especially, and please make sure that you have this in your application form. The consent must be given to the landlord. The agent is acting on behalf of the landlord. So if the consent is given to the landlord, the agent is doing the report on behalf of the landlord, then obviously the landlord is entitled to see this information. My advice is usually not to just dump all the information on the landlord. Give him a bit of a breakdown on what you found in terms of your credit check. And then this is not actually relevant to this one, but just, you know, while we're talking about this, are you allowed to redo your credit check on a renewal? It depends on the content of your lease agreement and your consent clause. In lease agreements that I am drafting, I will always have a clause that allows you to do further credit checks on renewals. But you can already bring this into your application process. But like I said earlier, if you do not have written consent to do a credit check, you're not allowed to, but your written consent may be done for future consent as well. All right, which checks must be done? So first of all, obviously your credit check. So you have multiple options on where to do your credit checks. I've had a conversation with the friendly guys from TPN, and they gave me a sample report. You're obviously more than welcome to do any other credit check, either through PayProp or whatever your heart desires. I do typically like to use the example from TPN's credit report for the simple reason that I prefer to have the payment profile data available. The reason why I want payment profile data is a tenant's judgment or a tenant's credit score or whatever the case might be, it could be quite misleading. Somebody can have a judgment, a big judgment even, but it does not impact the way they pay their rent. What I'm saying is, say for instance, you have a tenant that is a business owner. And this particular business owner ran into a bit of a problem with his previous business partner or whatever the case might be, and he ended up with a judgment against his name. But he's currently busy paying off the judgment, life is good, but they're paying their rent on time every single month. That judgment is clearly not impacting the way somebody is paying his rent. The same with a default. A default, however, is slightly different. A default is usually something that gets listed after sufficient notice, but prior to a court order. So why this doesn't concern me as much as a judgment is, it's usually on a few notices that somebody gets listed, gets a default. It's usually smaller amounts, but it carries the same impact as I just said about judgments. The fact that somebody is not paying a specific debt does not mean they're not going to not pay their rent. It means that specific thing is now listed on their credit report. It is crucial that the landlord is made aware of every single judgment and every single defect. I do like using a landlord disclaimer, or at least so a form that says, I am aware of the fact that this tenant has a judgment against his name or bad credit rating. I'm still happy to place him. It doesn't have to be an agreement per se. It can be as simple as an email from you, the agent, saying, Mr. Landlord, here's a problem on this tenant. This is what the problem is. Please confirm in writing that you would still like me to place the tenant. Why I enjoy the payment profile data is specifically because we are definitely going to see a credit amnesty within the next 2 years. I'm saying this from a Silna gut feel, not from anything else. I have seen over the past few years, every time we go move towards an election, we do have a credit amnesty. You're more than welcome to go and check that. But after last year and this year, the current economic situation, especially with COVID in mind, I cannot see that we're not going to have a credit amnesty anytime soon. What a credit amnesty does is it wipes away all your judgment and default data from our credit bureaus. So now what? How do we do vetting then? The only thing that gets left behind then is your payment profile data. Now, TPN does collect payment profile data, and they collect payment profile data from all of their users. So it's a very broad spectrum payment profile data collection that they do. And I think without that, you are definitely at a high risk. So this is why I've asked TPN, let's see if it works. to share. Oh yeah, I'm so excited to share their payment profile, a credit report, a sample credit report. So this is not real. This person doesn't exist. It was nicely done by the guys from TPN. I just want to show you what the payment profile data looks like. So this is your typical TPN report. It's not very different from any other credit bureau's report. What is different, however, is obviously the payment profile data, as I just mentioned. So as you scroll down through any one of your reports, your credit scores or whatever might differ from credit bureau to credit bureau. This is simply the way they give feedback on the data that they can see from this particular report. Let's look at this person. So now we're saying he's got a poor quality. This is a poor credit. He's got a poor credit score. This does not necessarily mean that he's going to be a bad tenant. However, if we look at something like possibility of squatting high, I would say really make sure the landlord is aware of this. Even send him this specific page and say, yo, Mr. Landlord, I know you're desperate for a tenant, there's a bit of a high risk here. Just be aware of this. If he still wants you to place him, make sure then you have in writing an instruction that the landlord acknowledges aware of this problem, and then he's still happy to place that particular tenant. Here you can see what's happening in this person's life. He's got 15 active accounts. Guys, this means this guy is living off credit. Currently, the interest rates are very low. I mean, basically anybody can have anything running in their life on credit, but that's going to have to correct. The scary part is because the interest rates are so low, people increased their credit. So this means when the credit, when the interest rate increase again, as it's going to, these people with the high accounts are unfortunately going to be the first ones who can't meet their monthly payment obligations. This is scary and it's a very high risk. The judgments are the least of my problems. It's more the high accounts that's the problem we are seeing. But what we do see, if we go down on the report and you can see the payment profile data, yes, all the payment history. This is a landlord. They did not pay in 2017. There's a landlord here, also a 2017 landlord, did not pay, but this person, so what happened here is this person didn't pay from December 2015 to Jan 2017. They moved to this landlord, didn't pay from Feb all the way through August. So what we're saying is, this guy hasn't paid rent in forever. He's jumping between properties. This makes him a particularly high risk tenant. There are more data from, for instance, a storage company, and you can see if he paid on time, did not pay or paid late. And from this, it's actually quite cute. You can see when he left the property there in January 2017, moved into another property, Feb. He didn't pay, but he paid for the storage company in March and April, and then he paid late. Okay, so what does this tell us? This tells us he's probably moving his more valuable items into storage, away from your rental premises, into a storage premises. So why? We can't attach the items in lieu of the landlord type of thing. This is a scary thing, and you need to look at every single part of your credit report. If you, I'm not going to go through the rest of this particular credit report, but I do want to go back to the conversation around the rest of the vetting process. It's important to consider every single part of your credit report in as much detail as you possibly can. Go complete Sherlock Holmes on it. If you see something funny, investigate it until you are satisfied that that won't cause a problem. Then your references. Previous landlords are crucial. Now, my little tip is on the application form, ensure that you have the detail of the previous landlord as well as the address where they rented. Immediately do a deed search on that address and ensure that the person's details you've received as the landlord is actually the owner of that property. I have seen more than 7 out of 10 cases where we do evictions, and I go back to the application form and the lease agreement and the whole situation, that if I ask the agent a question, did you make sure that the previous landlord you talked to was in fact the landlord? 7 out of 10, I get and then it wasn't. So you can already on that part of the application form see if this tenant is truthful or not. Do a deed search on the previous property and contact the landlord who's the owner of the property through Lightstone or deed search or your wind deed search, whatever. Make sure that the person you are talking to was in fact this person's previous landlord, because the previous landlord would be able to tell you exactly what's going on. Keep in mind that if you sit with a landlord who's currently busy with an eviction, he is unfortunately, I don't care what level of good person he is, he will tell you this tenant is amazing, why he just wants to get rid of him. So make sure you know what the current payment situation is by obviously checking your payment profile data and then ensuring that you are talking to the actual previous landlord to get a bit more information. And it's for that reason also that I do like to go at least 2 landlords back, the previous landlord, or at least the landlord where the tenant is currently residing, and then the previous landlord, to really get an idea of this tenant, especially the previous landlord. Will be able, I mean, it's nothing to him to tell you that this is a bad tenant. The tenant's already out of his property, so I do recommend going a few back. And then also confirm employment with the employer. Google the company that they are saying that the tenant is saying that he's working for, and ensure that you are actually talking through the reception to the actual HR part of that company to confirm employment and to confirm salary of that particular tenant. And then the correct process flow. How should we do this? So what I recommend is get your application form complete, do your credit check, do your reference checks, then do a short feedback to your landlord. These are the potential tenants. This is the feedback on their credit records, their reference checks. You can do a recommendation as the agent without a doubt, but never, ever, 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 ever place a tenant or send a lease agreement without the consent of the landlord, and get that in writing. Remember, I always talk about landlord amnesia. You place this tenant today, tomorrow there's a problem, and the landlord says, but I never said you can place this person. Get it on an email and say, thank you, Mr. Landlord, you called me and you confirmed that you like tenant X that I've sent to you. I confirm that I will now proceed to send out the lease agreement to the tenant for his consideration and potential conclusion. Then you are covered. Like I said, if there was a problem on your credit checks, make sure you have it in writing that you informed the landlord of that, and the landlord was still happy with you placing that particular tenant. Only once you have written consent from the landlord to place this tenant do you send the lease agreement. Why? The lease agreement is proposed terms. So you are saying, Mr. Tenant, on behalf of the landlord, these are the terms that we propose to conclude this lease agreement. Once the tenant accepts that, even verbally, there could be a lease agreement that comes into place. So make sure you only send your lease agreement once you have written consent from the landlord that you can place that particular tenant. Then once the lease agreement's been sent, the tenant is happy, he signs the agreement, comes back to you, get the landlord to sign the agreement, and there we go. We have a lease agreement in place. Who makes the final decision on who to place the tenant? only the landlord. The agent are never, ever, ever, ever mandated unless you have a power of attorney to rent the property on behalf of the landlord. A normal mandate is not sufficient to allow you the right to choose which tenant to place. If your landlord says, you know more than I do, you just place, still keep it in writing. In email, tell the landlord, these are the problems. This is why I recommend this tenant. Please confirm that you are happy with that. Only the landlord can make that decision, or the executor if the landlord is deceased, or say for instance the landlord is was liquidated or sequestrated, whatever the case might be. The curator on behalf of the particular estate, the trustee of the estate, only that person, so only the actual landlord may choose which tenant to place. Quickly, a few red flags. Like I said, thing that would drive the fear into me is high consumer credit. So if you see this person has a lot of open accounts, as we saw on the example credit report I've shown you, very, very, very high risk. And then if your payment profile data shows that this payment is, a person is constantly paying his rent late, even if it's in the grace period, even if it's, remember, there isn't an actual grace period in law, but it's recorded as such. That means in the first 7 days of the month, even if they pay just a little late, not like super late, little late light, it's still a problem. It means this tenant isn't that committed. You want to know this tenant pays his rent on time every single month. Then a foreign national. And the reason why foreign nationals are a concern and a potential red flag is we can't do proper vetting on them. They haven't been in the country for long enough, so we don't know what their credit ratings are. It's not true that we cannot evict foreign nationals. We definitely can. That's not the problem. The problem is if you have no data to vet somebody on, how do we know it's going to be a good tenant? So in that context, I usually recommend 6 months or more deposit, and potentially a local surety. And so sibling or something in South Africa to sign surety on behalf of the foreign national. Then affordability, you need to, you're not allowed to lease a property to somebody if it's going to cost more than a third of their salary is incorrect. That is a credit affordability thing that has no impact on rentals. It's not wise though. I do like knowing that the tenant can afford the rent. But say for instance, you have 2 tenants and both of them make loads of money, and they effectively going to spend one of their full salaries on the rent, but you can see there's still pockets of money after that the rent would be paid from the other tenant, and they are sharing a household and they will have enough money. You're more than welcome to do that, but it is a risky thing. As much as affordability isn't a requirement in law in rentals, it's a very good indicator of the tenant's ability to pay his rent, and we obviously want them to be able to pay rent. And then unemployment. If you've seen, if you've called the tenant's employer and you can hear the company is sort of on its last legs, it is a risk, and keep it in mind. It's especially those people that we want to help. Remember, we want to help people, but we need to make sure that in terms of our mandate, we help the landlord first, because as an agent, your mandate is to look out for the landlord, not to be nice to the tenant, but to protect the landlord. That's the mandate. And then if there's incorrect information on the application form in terms of, I'm going to lie to myself, I'm going to guess it's clause 22 of the lease agreement, or the lease agreements that's based on the TPN leaseback lease. I do allow for cancellation, immediate cancellation, when the tenant provided the incorrect information on the application form. The reason why we can do that is that was the information the landlord used to decide whether he's going to place the tenant or not. So it goes to the consensus of the lease agreement. And as we all know in law of contract, if you don't have consensus, you can't have a valid binding agreement. So make sure that the information is correct. And if you see a tenant did not provide the accurate information before you conclude the agreement, run like the wind. Because the truth is that tenant isn't going to be a truthful, honest tenant, and those are the problem tenants. So make sure that you don't, in pure desperation to place a tenant after you can clearly see that they are going to be a bit of a problem tenant. So that brings us to the end of today's session. I really hope this helped. I really hope I gave a few tips and a few pointers that might make your life a little easier. And if you have any questions, please let me know. And I think the most important thing when it comes to the application process is be as thorough as you possibly can. Go complete Sherlock Holmes, and please always trust your gut. If you have a bit of a gut feel that this is going to be a potential problem tenant or something just feels off, trust yourself and dig deep until you satisfy yourself that this is actually a safe, good tenant to place and to introduce to the landlord, and make sure that the landlord is aware of any potential risk from this tenant. Keep everything in writing, and I do hope that this will mean that the application process will be a bit more lengthy, but the rest of the rental process would then be much smoother. So on that high note, I hope that you guys are going to have a lovely day, and I hope that you have only good paying tenants and landlords that remember all the instructions. So have a lovely day, and it was nice spending this training session with you. Thank you once again for allowing me to do these trainings and to host these webinars. Have an absolutely awesome day.